All right. Yeah, about me. So I have had the immense privilege of working and living all over the world. These stars are where I have been. Dartmouth is colder than Wyoming and also than Antarctica. That's true. That's where I got my PhD. I'm currently here in Budapest on a Marie Curie, and I have lived and worked in all these places. And I will soon be joining the faculty at the University of Wyoming, which for someone who is a skier and a hiker is just about the best outcome I could have possibly envisioned. And I will then throw a little bit of advertising for that as well. If you have any PhD students or undergraduates who are looking for some place to be outside of the big city, it doesn't get much better than that. All right. Another fact related to the previous facts. So I'm quite proud to have this large and diverse network of collaborators that spans 5 continents. And it's also enabled a lot of the science that I'm going to talk about today. So stellar physics, sadly, is, I would say, more of a thing in Europe and Australia than it is in the US. But there are certainly elements that can be brought in the use of stellar physics and application of stellar physics from all different continents. And typically my papers span at least 3, and obviously that wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't been able to travel and visit a lot of people. I'm also a member of the MESA developers, so modules for experiments in stellar astrophysics. You'll recognize one of these guys sitting in the room here on this slide as well. And I know there has recently been a hire at CCA for a software engineer, partially in support of this project, which I think we're all pretty excited about. Other things I will talk about extensively in this talk are gyre, and I will not talk at all about that, about Mesa to Hydro, but it is a package that I wrote as well. Another important part, I think, of my profile is that I consider myself to be a part-time D-list science celebrity. And what that means is I accidentally work on the only stars that ever get anyone's attention, and mostly that's Betelgeuse. Sometimes it's T Ursa Minoris. We'll talk about that as well. And these are examples of sort of some popular science coverage that we got at the end of 2020. And this led ultimately to one of my favorite facts about myself, which is that I am a known dubious Wikipedia source. Right? So I haven't actually checked this recently, but it was true in 2020, and I believe in 2021 as well. If you go to the page on Betelgeuse, my parameters are listed next to the phrase "which if accurate," which is something you could reasonably say about any fact, but they decided to put it there for my fact, and I am proud of that. Okay. Yeah. No, which if accurate. Yeah, I don't know if it has anything to do with like this situation, but that's what's happening. Okay. Thank you for indulging that stand-up routine. All right. Most of this talk will unfortunately not be about Betelgeuse, but it will feature. We're going to talk about results from a paper recently revised and resubmitted to APJ last week. Results from stellar evolution in real time 2. I have another QR code here. I'm hinting at things. And this of course begs the question, what is stellar evolution in real time 1? And in both of these cases, what we're doing is we're looking at the longitudinal variability of stars that are undergoing thermal pulses. So this is one of the only evolutionary features in a star's life that it's even possible to capture on human or pseudo-human timescales. So we're talking about decades to hundreds of years. This talk will also feature guest appearances by Betelgeuse, because some of the techniques are the same. And also from T Ursa Minoris, which was the subject of the study that sort of launched this technique or this method that I call real-time seismic stellar evolution. So this is a combination of high precision stellar modeling, 1D stellar modeling, but also astroseismic quantities, astroseismic analysis, and doing that at very high time resolution as well. And in addition, the third kind of key ingredient, and arguably the most important ingredient in all of this, is using observations that have been collected in historical archives. So we're talking about things like the American Association of Variable Star Observers, which compiles and collects data over at least 100-year timescales. And in the case of the star, I'll spend most of today talking about, we actually have been blessed with 400 years of observations. And I can talk a little bit about how that even makes sense, right? Okay, so AGB stars. They are the chemical enrichment engines of the universe. Dramatic pause. What is an AGB star? So surface level, very bright, large radius. These are stars that could be observed by the naked eye. That is how we managed to have records of them going back before the modern era. In a lot of cases, this is neither of the stars I'm going to talk about, but it's a prettier one, right? It's the Instagram version of an AGB star. So this is U Camelopardalis, which is an AGB star that has visible dust shells. So AGB stars undergo these thermal pulses, which I'll talk a lot about, where they're blowing off gas and dust, and they're leaving behind dust shells in some cases, and the eventual fate of this after blowing off the outer layers will be a white dwarf. So AGB stars are evolved low to intermediate mass stars in the late stages of their lives. They've exhausted their core hydrogen and helium, and they have transitioned to this more complicated burning structure where they're burning hydrogen and helium in shells surrounding an inert core of carbon and oxygen. So in the core of this star, helium accumulates from hydrogen shell burning, and as the helium builds up, it becomes dense and hot enough to undergo helium fusion. Now, this helium fusion occurs in a shell that surrounds the core, and the process of this helium fusion is not always stable. So we sometimes get a thermal runaway situation. The fusion process experiences a runaway reaction, which leads to a sudden increase in temperature and energy production in the helium burning shell. Now, this ultimately results in the thermal pulse, which is a sudden increase in energy production. It's triggered by that, and during the pulse, the outer layers of the star expand and cool and blow off and cause the star to become temporarily brighter and larger. And we'll talk more about that. This is the eventual fate of the sun and sun-like stars, with masses up to the minimum mass for carbon ignition. And at that mass, the eventual death trajectory of the star changes. And what that mass is somewhere between 5 and 8 solar masses. People in this room will have a much stronger opinion about that than I do. And it depends who you ask, what assumptions you make, all of that kind of stuff. Here is a stellar track showing the trajectory of an AGB star. So this is a 1 solar mass model analogous to the sun. You are here, right, somewhere in the middle of this, evolving up the red giant branch, hitting the helium flash in the upper right-hand corner, falling back down, and then ascending in parallel along the asymptotic giant branch, which is where we'll get these pulse features that I'll talk about later, and then eventually moving across the HR diagram onto the white dwarf cooling sequence. So these stars can be hard to distinguish from large red giant branch stars based only on surface parameters. And in a lot of kind of large scale observational survey contexts, AGB stars are considered pollutants, which is rude, but that's fine. Not in my opinion, but in any case, people are interested in being able to distinguish between RGB and AGB stars based on surface parameters in a very efficient way for that reason. And so here is a case that is in fact not demonstrative because we have distinguished them, but you get the idea. In the color magnitude diagram, they look like this, right? So we need some kind of information that's telling us, you know, the density is different or some other feature is different to place them in this other evolutionary state. So Mira or miracle variable stars, these are AGB stars, but not all AGB stars are Miras. Some are semi-regular variables. That's more of an observational classification. And all AGB stars are thought to undergo some form of thermal pulsing, hence TP-AGB star. I hate acronyms, but that's a lot of words, so you're going to see TP-AGB a lot of times. Okay. Why do we care? AGB stars chemically enrich the galaxy and universe. They are prolific producers of heavy elements through nucleosynthesis processes occurring in their interiors. And during their evolution, they synthesize elements such as carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, heavier elements like S-process elements, and understanding the nucleosynthesis that occurs in TP-AGB stars helps us understand the chemical evolution of galaxies and the enrichment of the interstellar medium with the elements necessary for the formation of planets and life. You exist because of these stars. Okay. I tend to be a bit dramatic. All right. They're cosmological distance indicators. So they're used in this way due to their high luminosities and predictable properties, periods. They are employed to estimate distances to nearby galaxies and sort of determine the scale of the universe, like asterisk, many controversies here, but they are used in this way. They influence galactic dynamics and feedback. So the mass loss and energy injection from TP-AGB stars is really important, and understanding the role of these stars in galactic dynamics, star formation, and feedback processes is necessary for constructing models of the galaxy, its formation, its evolution. So what's going on today, but also how we got there. They're sites for important nuclear processes, which I touched on earlier. And they also represent the dominant source of uncertainty in galactic chemical evolution models, which might be something that's a little more close to home here. So in addition to this, TP-AGB stars are prevalent in old and intermediate age stellar populations. And so studying these stars provides insights into the formation and evolution of stellar populations in galaxies and their contribution to the integrated properties of galaxies, such as colors, spectra, chemical abundances. Yeah, and thermal pulses are the only stellar evolutionary process observable in a single star on human timescales that's not a supernova. Yes, I know, it's not a supernova. But aside from that, ignoring that, they are the only non-violent, non-volatile stellar evolutionary process observable in a single star on human timescales.
Doesn't the second last point mean not that we're only here because of AGB stars, but we only don't know why we're here because of AGB stars?
And if you want to be pedantic about it, sure. Yeah. But so these stars represent a crucial phase in the evolution of low to intermediate mass stars, and studying them and their properties helps refine our stellar evolution models, improves our understanding of the life cycles of stars and their outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think hopefully I have made a case, and now you will reward me by listening to me talk about them for the next 40 minutes. Features of AGB stars. So I touched on the sort of stellar evolutionary track in an earlier slide, but this is a graphic that accompanied the first kind of popular science release of the first paper on this, which is on T Ursa Minoris. So our sun is here in the middle of the main sequence. Everything's good. We're good for another 5 billion years. It's fine. But eventually we will not be good, but we're going to have a problem here anyway before we even get to this point. But if you're looking in kind of HR space, brightness temperature space, the AGB phase looks kind of weird. So you're just getting these kind of oscillations back and forth. But what you can really glean from this is the magnitude of the brightness change. And so you can't exactly tell how quickly things are happening in this space. I'll show other figures, but the degree of variation you're getting in these pulses is enormous in the scale of brightness variations in stars. So they're super bright, and the amplitude is super huge. So let's zoom in and put this in the space that we actually use when we talk about this. So this is part of a pulse spectrum. So this is 2 solar mass, a little bit more metal rich than the sun model, computed with MESA. And here we're seeing sort of in luminosity, and this is Oh, there's no, sorry, the label got cut off. This is time, right? But we're getting an idea of sort of how rapid these things are. We're talking about sort of 100 to 500 year timescales for the pulses, and an interpulse region of something on the order of 1,000 to several thousand years. So if you catch one of these just right observationally, you can see a pretty massive transition in brightness or equivalently in radius over a short amount of time.
Is the x-axis in years or seconds?
Yeah, the x-axis is in years. Yes. Yes, it's in years. Okay. So in studying these types of stars, I am actually exploiting the simultaneous existence of two dynamical behaviors. So the first are the pulses that I discussed. And this is the anatomy of a thermal pulse. This is a diagram showing what's going on in the stellar interior when this is happening. So the helium fusion process that I mentioned earlier experiences a runaway reaction. It leads to a sudden increase in temperature and energy production in the helium burning shell, and that triggers a thermal pulse. So during this pulse, the outer layers of the star expand and cool, cause it to become much brighter. And in this process, there is an inducement of convective mixing in the helium burning shell. So this convective mixing brings fresh fuel, which is helium, from the outer layers of the star into the burning shell, which reignites and sustains the fusion process. And I will punt this to later in the talk. When this gets vigorous enough, we start to get third dredge up, which is actually really interesting. So that's what's going on in the sort of evolutionary sense when I study these stars.
So just on this diagram, those lines are about the thick. Like, what is the thickness of the shells? Like, are the shells are really that thin? Is what I'm asking.
So I think the better graphic for that, I don't know that this is a realistic imagining of the thickness. The shells themselves are very, very thin compared to the convection zone. That's certainly true. The depth of the convective envelope.
Okay, I'm just wondering, it says helium shell and it points to a line in your diagram.
But that's the maximum degeneration, and that there's a spread around it.
Ah, that's I see. Okay, so there is some thickness around.
Right, it's very thin.
It's very thin, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And this is so sorry, this is maybe something that is like niche to stellar modelers, but hashing, this means convection always, right? That's yeah. Okay. So yes, so the pulse, this is your helium flash episode. This is an evolutionary behavior. And the timescale for this is hundreds to thousands of years. Meanwhile, we have pulsations, right? Different words. I have used the wrong ones in papers before, but pulsations refer to coherent global oscillation in the envelope, and this is a seismic behavior. So we are talking about pressure modes moving through the convective cavity. We're talking about the kappa mechanism. This is a different type of thing. This is not an evolutionary behavior. This is a coherent oscillation. And the timescale of this is hundreds of days. So T. Ursa minoris, paper 1, and R. Haya, paper 2, are experiencing both. And more specifically, they are experiencing both detectably. That's the key. So going first to T. Ursa minoris, the kind of seminal paper on this. So this star is exhibiting a dramatic change in amplitude of its oscillations in visual magnitude over the last 30 years plus 5 years, because this was a 2019 paper. But here is a composite light curve constructed by Laszlo Molnar, who's my core collaborator and who I'm working with primarily in Hungary right now. And so this is 100 years, right? This is starting from 1905. And this is an AAVSO visual light curve. That's the data we're working with, and tons of really interesting work went into the photometric analysis and reclassification of this star. And the punchline is that we eventually uncovered a new oscillation mode. So it was a thermal pulse inducing a mode transition, and that ended up being a really powerful constraint and making this a really interesting modeling problem. Now, Turning to Archaea, we have an even longer observational history. So this light curve is showing measurements going back about 200 years, but we actually have 400 in practice. But this is what we could construct of the visual light curve analogous to the previous one. Now, Archaea has an even longer observational history. This figure is showing the light curve and period evolution of the star. So in this case, we're actually incorporating measurements from DASH, which are photometric plates that have been manually put into a database at Harvard. And so we have recordings from, what is this, 1670 or so of the star at its maximum brightness. We have the absence of that information, which is also a constraint. And then as we kind of move into the modern era, we have more and more observations until we have quite refined measurements down here. So we're looking at a 400-year observational history. Why is this significant? It is significant because observational records have been collected for a long enough time that we can actually compare them to evolutionary timescales, or at least the most rapid phases. Okay, water. So in paper one, we had we exploited this technique to determine that the pulse, that we were observing a thermal pulse into T Ursa Minoris, and specifically we were observing a pulse at what we call the onset phase. And now that is a particularly rapid subcomponent of the pulse. It ended up being very constraining. The thermal pulse induced a mode transition. We had all of these nice constraints. And, you know, we had some interesting coverage, including like this is how the Earth is going to end and things like that. But basically, the point of this is that to our knowledge, the first time that a star has actually been directly observed and confirmed to be in this stage. So working from this framework, this paper laid the groundwork. We move on to modeling Archaea in the same way. So AGB pulse spectra are usually presented in terms of brightness or radial variation, as I showed before. So this is typically how we would look at them. And yeah, you would see these pulse spectra in terms of luminosity, radius, temperature, things like that. But
sorry, can I ask a question? These wiggles look different than the observed wiggles, which were like some of which were kind of oscillatory, like more sinusoidal, and some of which are like very sawtooth.
We will get to that on the very next slide. Thank you. Yes, I did not pay him. Okay. All right. So you may have noticed that these wiggles look weird and not like the thing that we want to study, for example. That's because the measurements we have of Archaea are measurements of its period, not measurements of its brightness, right? So this changes the nature of the problem considerably. To make the use of these observations, we have 400 years of, we need to fit models to Archaea that are theoretical calculations of how its period evolves, not luminosity, brightness, temperature, right? And to make optimal use of these observations, we need to compute a thermal pulse spectrum in terms of period. And not just P twiddle R, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the real actual solutions to the oscillation equations, which are more complicated than this. And to that end, we now invoke gyre. And maybe you've heard this joke before working at CCA, but Rich Townsend insists that gyre stands for gives you random eigenvalues. So hopefully not random, hopefully useful. But we want to use a tool like this that is actually taking a structural model of a star, perturbing it, and seeing what its entire resonance response is, what the entire oscillation response is when you do that, right? And that is far more information than just doing a p twiddle r relation. So to do this, we introduce what I call the seismic evolution method. So first, we evolve a stellar track from birth through the end of the asymptotic giant branch phase. And I'll just throw this up here again. So we're starting from the pre-main sequence, evolving through the main sequence up to the red giant branch, and then eventually up into this region, as I've shown before. But recall that so this isn't a continuous line, obviously, it's a simulation. Each of these is a point, right? Each of these is a point, and each point is a structural model. So every time step contains a structural model. So we want certain seismic quantities that can be calculated from the stellar structure directly by perturbing the model and seeing how it vibrates. Gyre solves the oscillation equations directly to produce a synthetic frequency spectrum, which we can then compare to the observed frequency patterns and invert this to get the period, right? So this is a three-step process in theory, or at least the bad way I did it first was. We compute the tracks to identify candidate models. We set some region here, or in this case here in the AGB phase. We set conditions to output the structural model at some time step, and then we use that structural model as initial conditions to gyre for the full seismic perturbation calculations. Fine. But there's a better way to do this, and that is gyre on the fly, right? So running these kinds of calculations is not an out-of-the-box capability of MESA. MESA and gyre are shipped together, but they are separate codes. However, we can call gyre from within MESA and therefore reduce the need for separate sets of simulations. We can redirect the gyre output to be saved as part of MESA's data structure, which reduces data volume, and we can obtain exact solutions to the adiabatic and linear oscillation equations at each time step. So that means we don't have to rely on these poor scaling relations for seismic parameters. So as a result, we can trace the long timescale evolution of exact seismic quantities as if they were fundamental parameters like temperature and luminosity, and this is extremely powerful. So I want to highlight Dora here, who is a collaborator and colleague of mine in Hungary, who basically did this for us. So Earl Bellinger, another MESA developer, has a lab. All of this is MESA's fully open source. All of this is available online. So he has a summer school lab that one of the exercises was to kind of attempt to put this gyre on the fly technique in for an example model. Now it turns out doing this for AGB calculations and in all of the other complexities we had is a much more difficult exercise, and Dora did a lot of it, and I think that it's really great that she did it. Okay, so we implemented gyre on the fly, and we were able to then collect the pressure modes that we were interested in for at every time step along a thermal pulse spectrum, which is already itself a fairly computationally intensive part of a MESA simulation. So here, this figure is synthetic. This is a thermal pulse spectrum shown in terms of period. So each of these curves corresponds to the pressure mode, a radial pressure mode. So NP equals 0 is your fundamental pressure mode. This is your first overtone in black, and so on and so forth down to the 9th radial mode. So we're not doing, for those that know astroseismology, there's no L, there's no M in this. We're just talking about radial orders. But basically, I'm quite proud of this because it is not a small feat to get gyre to produce a synthetic frequency spectrum for for every single time step on the thermal pulse spectrum for a range of reasons. But figure like this, a data set like this, is available for every model in our grid. And all of this is in the process of being made publicly available. Okay, so thanks to this, we have these period measurements of our Haya. we have now generated the theoretical data that we can compare to it directly. We've done the work to develop that. Great, we're in a good position. But there's another problem. Just because we're observing a period or a frequency doesn't mean we know the mode. It doesn't mean we know the mode. So periods can correspond to different driving modes, and we don't know which a priori, right? And the significance of this ambiguity, I think, is best demonstrated by the current controversy surrounding Betelgeuse. Which mode is which? So in my paper and friends and similar follow-up papers, all of which you should read because they're all great, we decided that Betelgeuse's observed 416-day periodicity corresponded to the fundamental mode, which is the lowest frequency pressure mode. Others decided that wasn't the case. So if you actually compute, if you run the Fourier spectrum on Betelgeuse's composite history, so we generate a light curve similar to those that I showed that spans for about 100 years. You run Fourier on that, and you get a secondarily dominant periodicity at a longer period, which we and this group think is the long secondary period. But another group said, okay, we think that that period is actually the fundamental mode, which would make this 416-day periodicity the first overtone. And when you make that assumption instead of this assumption, the difference between the FM and the O1 is the difference between Betelgeuse going supernova in 100,000 years versus a few hundred years. Right? So this is a very significant assumption that has far-reaching implications for your simulations and your models. So this group on the right, the Sal et al. Paper, they discerned that when you make this assumption about the periodicities, that Betelgeuse is currently in the midst of core carbon burning, which puts it on a sort of short path to exploding. And the other groups collectively don't find that. So this is a pretty significant difference in assumption. So which mode is which? It depends who you ask. And as this Pop Science article title says, when will Betelgeuse go supernova? Will it happen in the next few decades? It depends who you ask, but more specifically, it depends which mode you assume it's pulsating in. Okay. Like Betelgeuse, Archaea could be pulsating in either the fundamental mode or the O1. And this figure shows period in days as a function of age in mega years. And the gray curve, the higher amplitude curve, is the fundamental mode, calculations for the fundamental mode, and the black curve are calculations for the first overtone. And significantly, I've color-coded the luminosity temperature domain that's consistent with the observational sort of bounds on Archaea, but also the observational bounds on how much its period has changed. And there are solutions along both of these curves that are consistent with all of those things, right? So we want to remain agnostic about this hypothesis. And I should say that for the higher order modes, there wasn't any overlap, so no need to look at those. So we perform all calculations under both assumptions, just to be safe.
Wait, I haven't followed this. Which one of these point? The gray, oh, okay, the gray is the fundamental mode. What is the pink and the yellow? So this is hard to see. The pink means it intersects with the radial constraints we have for the star, and the yellow means it intersects with your kind of HR diagram constraints. And so there are all I'm trying to demonstrate here is that there are regions on both of these curves where, whether it's the fundamental mode or first overtone, you're intersecting with all the observational constraints. So we actually need even more information than this to break the degeneracy. Where are those two? Is it where is it? So it has to be pink, yellow in those bounds. And
in these bounds, yeah. So the bad design maybe. The yellow overlaps with the pink in some cases, but in this situation, okay, you would have some of the O1s that are valid. Yeah. No, fair enough. Okay. Yes. So we perform all calculations under both assumptions. Archaea's period evolution is very fast over a very short time. That's why we're noticing it. And it's actually only compatible with a few parts of the thermal pulse. So in kind of the zoomed out picture, there are two regions. We could imagine that, so these are the actual period observations. I've just reproduced them at two different locations. And there are two different kind of areas that they could correspond to. But if we zoom in even further, there's really only one. So this phase here is what we call the pulse onset, or the knee feature. And this decline is slow compared to the knee feature. So T. Ursa minoris was mapping that. But here, this is a better fit. So we call this the maximum or the power down phase. And that's actually the only region that's really compatible with the observations. So as I just said, in contrast, for T. Ursa minoris, the pulse onset or knee phase is the only viable fit. And I got a lot better at making figures since this 5 years difference here. But basically, if you can see it, the red here are the observations for T. Ursa minoris, and they fit the knee quite nicely. And this is basically 100 years, so you're getting a pretty huge drop there. And that ends up being.
Can you just point to where the observations are there?
Yeah,
darker one?
they're in red. So this red here, and then color coded in red. It's a basically perfect overlap.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So the region that we find and argue that Archaea traces within a pulse is actually a bit less constraining than the one that T. Ursa minoris traced, but nevertheless we persist. Okay, so the fitting algorithm for this is a bit of a nightmare for a range of reasons. So the data set poses a number of difficulties. First of all, there are heterogeneous uncertainties and non-uniform sampling considerations. So the last 160 years of period measurements are significantly more precise and frequent than earlier measurements. There's a large difference in precision between the period measurements and the measurements of its other fundamental parameters, like temperature, luminosity, and radius. There is no one-to-one correspondence between the measurements of all parameters. So for example, we can compare 210 individual period measurements taken over 400 years versus 1 to maybe 2 or 3 measurements of luminosity, temperature, and radius taken over the last 30 years, not to mention the fact that if this is in earnest a thermal pulse, those values would have changed as well. So there's also other physics, and by this I mean meandering, that is going on with Archaea that MESA does not capture. And I think this goes back to your question about what are these extra wiggles there. And it's not necessarily straightforward to disentangle what is evolutionary and what is meandering. So this is what I mean by that. So the underlying slope of this data set, so these are the observations are in green, and in red are the interpolated corresponding values from the model that I'm comparing to, the MESA model. So the underlying slope of this is due to stellar evolution, and the shorter oscillations are due to meandering. But we bias the fit results if we assume the shape of the evolutionary slope. So we don't exactly know what this is doing here. And the physics of meandering is not included in MESA, nor is it, to my knowledge, included in anything.
What do you mean by meandering?
Yes, period meandering. Okay, so mirror variables, semi-regular variables, they exhibit these sort of decadal to centennial wobbles that are only semi-periodic. And I think the physics of that is not well understood, but mode transitions and things like that are hypothesized. Yeah, but it's not in MESA is the main point. Okay, so how do we deal with this? We use a weighted distance metric, kind of a root mean square framework to compute a quantity like this for both the variables that we only have one measurement for and the variable that we have 210 measurements for. We consider two composite goodness of fit metrics. They use all parameters. We combine them in multiple ways, and we enforce a minimum slope hardness requirement in that the model curve must decline by at least some amount S to be considered a viable fit. So this is sort of a fudge parameter saying this part of the thermal pulse is valid, but this other part isn't. So the features that are permitted within pulse morphology are the knee or onset solution, the power down, and the helium subflash. So these are constricted by basically a requirement that the helium luminosity must exceed the hydrogen luminosity by some amount. That means that you're within a pulse. This feature, though, this kind of weaker, shallower sloped feature, does satisfy that condition. So there's no reason to remove it from consideration. And yeah, so this figure is showing an example of one pulse computed with MESA. This is your fundamental mode period versus age. And these horizontal lines are showing in green, the minimum period consistent with the observations, and in orange that the maximum period has to fall within this span. And then I have an algorithm that identifies the local maxima under those constraints. So there's also the issue of alignment. We have an age of order a few hundred megayears, but we're talking about things that are on the order of a few hundred years. So you can basically treat the age as arbitrarily sliding this wherever you want to. There's no reason we can't do that. So we automatically identify the maximum and align the period observations with the maximum of the pulse, center it there, and then produce a fit file that creates synthetic ages for the observations that align with the model, and then we do our pointwise distance metric comparison. Now, when we run all of this over a large grid, we obtain a variety of goodness of fit measurements as a function of initial mass and initial metallicity assumed in the model. So here are several of these heat maps. I am not going to talk about all of them, but when we emphasize agreement with luminosity, we can emphasize agreement with temperature, radius, we can emphasize agreement with the periods only, since those constraints are a lot better than any of the other ones. We can combine them in a harmonic way, or we can combine them in sort of a pseudo chi-squared way, where I treat all of the classical observations, luminosity, temperature, and radius. I sum those together and divide them by 3 and treat that as equivalent with the period measurements themselves. So it's sort of a balance between the classical and astroseismic constraints. And we do this for the fundamental mode solutions, which are these maps, and the first overtone solutions, which are those. I'm going to focus on the composite statistic that we end up liking best, which is this map F configuration. So focusing on this, these are the best fitting pulses according to a fundamental mode assumption and using this particular statistical realization. And what we see here is so this is a heat map with metallicity and the initial mass of the model. And there's kind of like a fairly well-defined sequence of what we call good solutions to our Haya that form an arc. When we do this for the first overtone, the solution space becomes much more restricted. And I should say there's sort of an initial requirement that the model must fall within the observational parameters. And if it's outside those parameters plus some uncertainty, then we don't proceed with the rest of the calculations. So a lot more of the space is ruled out in the O1 hypothesis than in the FM hypothesis, which is already sort of indicative. But after doing this in like a purely data science, like not worried if this is reality or not sort of way, we can then look to the literature and see what that has to tell us about its parameters. So in comparing to literature and other constraints, first of all, if we put sort of a maximum on how metal rich the star could possibly be based on where we think it is in the galaxy, some of this space gets ruled out on those grounds. And then there are a few other crazy people who try to model AGB stars, and these are the vertical hatched regions correspond to those observations. So we've got a pretty good agreement with Zylstra in 2002. We have a little bit of overlap with Dessen et al. And over here, we have no overlap with Fadiev 2023, who I actually spoke to during revision of this paper. And the reason for this is because he assumed in his models that the period had stabilized over the last 20 years, and Laszlo found in his reanalysis that it didn't. And that makes a big difference in the answer you get.
I think there's a question.
Yeah.
Are G modes completely damped in these types of stars?
G mode's completely damped. I don't know the answer to that, but they certainly don't play any role in our fitting. We're looking only at the pressure modes. Yeah, do you know?
I think G modes are damped because the envelope is convective.
Yeah.
Hard to get G modes out.
Yeah. G modes. Okay, cool. Same thing for the O1. And it turns out that in this case, the majority, well, about a third of the space is ruled out just on the grounds that the metallicity would be too rich. So we're tending towards the conclusion that O1 is not the fit for this. What have we learned from this? Metallicities above about 0.5 dex are ruled out by an upper limit on the metallicity of the galactic regions that our Haya could plausibly have come from. So not the bulge, for example. Our best fitting model show some agreement with other derivations in the literature, with the exception of Fadiev, for reasons discussed. And while we cannot constrain the mass and metallicity precisely individually, the best solutions are constrained by a relatively tight relation between mass and metallicity. So I just did kind of a simple quadratic fit here, came up with these relations. And something I maybe should have said earlier, the interesting thing is that our Haya has a well-separated companion. Now, there is no metallicity for that companion yet in the literature, but were we to determine the metallicity of that companion, we could then basically collapse this space and get the mass of this star, which is pretty cool. Okay, so almost a third of the O1 models are ruled out by the metallicity limit, making it less likely that we're observing the O1 mode in our Haya. So we're basically going to say probably the FM. Okay, now kind of the third piece of this paper, we're going to probe the internal physics of our Haya and look at the kind of third dredge up and nucleosynthesis related considerations here. So I have borrowed slides from Amanda on this, Amanda Karakis, who is our queen of AGB nucleosynthesis. So the third dredge up is this mixing event that happens for low mass stars kind of 3 separate times, and we have a kind of intermediate mass star where it's happening twice. So the third dredge up typically occurs after several thermal pulses have already occurred. It doesn't happen right away. And this is because during each thermal pulse, the convective mixing becomes deeper and deeper and more efficient. And eventually convection reaches down to layers where significant amounts of carbon and other fusion byproducts have accumulated from previous hydrogen and helium burning stages. And when that happens, there are often, well, there would be signatures of those elements in the spectrum of the star. Now, getting spectral observations of AGB stars is difficult and is another issue, but kind of the smoking gun for has third dredge up happened is, are there certain elements detectable in its spectrum? And one of them is technetium. And then another is, has the carbon oxygen ratio inverted? Why is this important? So the third dredge up determines how much helium shell material is mixed from the core to the envelope. Mass loss determines the number of thermal pulses, and the combination of these two things basically determines the role that AGB stars play in the origin of the elements and the evolution of the universe. So MESA can do third dredge up in theory. but it requires a quite careful treatment of convective boundaries, and this is sort of a known difficulty with MESA. This is discussed at length in both the 4th and 5th instrument papers. But on the other hand, the Monash stellar evolution code, which Amanda runs and John Latanzio runs, and these people in Australia, this was designed specifically for the asymptotic giant branch and third dredge up calculations. So we elect to supplement our preferred MESA models with Monash calculations. And what I'm showing here is a selection we've made of models that are sort of in this hot, well-fitting region. And I choose an arc here too, because in one of our other statistical realizations, there's sort of a resonance pattern here, and just to check and see what's going on. So we call this the primary fundamental mode ridge and the secondary fundamental mode ridge. And we look at the O1 as well. And when we examine, so we select these models, I hand them to Julia Cinquegrana, who's my PhD student, and she runs the clones of these models with the same physics as best they can be matched, and we examine whether third dredge up has happened in her calculations with the parameters and settings being cloned as best as possible. And when we do that, tables are bad, but here's what happens. We want to compare situations where the pulse at which third dredge up is initialized, is that before or after the best fitting pulse according to the MESA models, right? So the ones highlighted in green, these models exhibit third dredge up, and they always exhibit third dredge up. Even when we change the physical conditions, we modify helium, we modify other considerations in the model grid, and always we have pulse of third dredge up occurs before best fitting pulse, right? None of these models ever exhibit third dredge up. And these models here are ambiguous. So these models are within 2 thermal pulses of exhibiting dredge up, or they change whether they exhibit dredge up depending on the treatment of helium. Now, the physics of AGB stars in stellar models is very, very uncertain, and we should not read too much into precise pulse indices. But that said, there's a case to be made against these, because at no point do the Monash models ever exhibit third dredge up, whereas they do in the upper regions. So this rules out our, I actually have that on the slide. This rules out the secondary ridge. Okay, so has third dredge up happened in Archaea? This is a question. There is some evidence from spectroscopy. Technetium is sometimes detected and sometimes not, including from the exact same spectra. It's quite hard to determine the existence of these lines. There is some evidence from isotopic ratios. It's weak, but it's present. There is evidence from calculations to some extent. So third dredge up is consistently present in the fundamental mode models below a certain mass, and the pulse at which it occurs is within the modeling uncertainty for the rest of the fundamental mode models along the ridge with the best fitting models. And so what I mean is these stars, these examples do exhibit third dredge up at some point. Sometimes the pulse is before the MESA best fitting pulse, sometimes it's after. These never do, and the O1 never do as well. So we've basically ruled the O1 out here because there's kind of weak evidence from a variety of observational sources that third dredge up is present. Now, simplifying physical assumptions. I have thus far presented results calculated under 2 assumptions. The first is that the modes are linear, and the second is that the conditions of AGB stars are adiabatic. Neither of those things is true. That's not true, right? So let's look a little bit closer at non-adiabaticity and nonlinearity. So when I use, so gyre has non-adiabatic mode. It is harder to use. It is harder to converge. The equations are harder to solve, but I do manage to do it for some of our sort of test case models. And this figure is showing the period versus age for the fundamental and first overtone modes in adiabatic versus non-adiabatic mode. Now, there is some temporal shift, right? There's like an extra pulse when you use non-adiabatic mode, and the reason for that is because non-adiabatic mode requires much greater structural resolution. Yeah, go ahead.
What is actually doing the damping of the mode?
What is doing
Is it radiatively non-adiabatic? Is it turbulence in the convective zone? And
I don't think I know the answer to that.
it's radiative.
Okay, good. So the shift horizontally is basically a resolution issue. The thing that actually matters for determining what our best fit to Archaea is the period. And the discrepancy for adiabatic versus non-adiabatic when we do this is pretty marginal. It's significantly below the uncertainties. There's something like a 2 to 5% difference. So we're not too worried about this, and it's very expensive for the gain that you actually get. Now, nonlinearity is a different situation. So I don't run any nonlinear calculations for this, but there are scaling relations available from Tribucci et al. 2021. So these are calibrated to specific AGB observations, and obviously anytime you're doing a calibrated scaling relation, you inherit the biases of the sample you're calibrating to, et cetera, but all those caveats aside, this is fast, right? Because these are scaling, you're getting periods from a scaling relation where you only need to factor in the present day mass and present day radius. So there's no calculation actually required. It's just post-processing with that information we already have from MESA. Now, the alignment is the same because the underlying model is the same, but the period discrepancy is high enough that we're like, okay, maybe we should worry about this a little bit and recompute the heat map and see what happens, right? So when we do this, when we rerun all of the calculations, recompute the heat maps under the nonlinear scaling relations, we find that the overall shape of the fundamental mode solution space changes a little bit when nonlinear scaling is used instead of direct linear calculations. So the difference is a matter of this, right? So the effects are most prominent for models with the lowest initial masses and metallicities. The nonlinear solution space is tighter than the linear space, and because the linear and nonlinear solutions diverge more at later pulses, the results for Archaea are not strongly impacted, but it's maybe something you want to think about if you want to use this grid for a star that's in a much, much later pulse, right? But what's much more interesting, I think, about this is that using the nonlinear periods in pulse fitting increases the evidence for recent third dredge up significantly. So this chart is the same as this one, but we have used the nonlinear periods instead. And in all cases now, the pulse at which third dredge up begins in Monash is earlier than the best fitting pulse in MESA when we use the nonlinear periods, whereas it's a little bit more ambiguous at the higher masses in the other case. So I think that's quite interesting. So the conclusions from these additional considerations are that the comparison between the adiabatic and non-adiabatic calculations suggests that the conditions of the star we are studying, so Archaea specifically, they're only weakly non-adiabatic, and this is especially true for pulse indices less than about 20. The disagreement between adiabatic and non-adiabatic calculations and the disagreement between linear and nonlinear calculations both worsen as the models evolve, so with increasing TP index, and this is of course because things are getting more stratified, the idea of instantaneous heat transfer doesn't apply as much, et cetera, et cetera. Running gyre in non-adiabatic mode is significantly more expensive for not much gain in Archaea's case. However, this might be worthwhile for structural models in the later pulses, but even so, our grid provides the adiabatic solutions for these regions, which provide the initial conditions for non-adiabatic solutions anyway. So hopefully that's still useful. And periods from nonlinear scaling relations better support the conclusion that we are indeed observing a thermal pulse that has recently undergone third dredge up. Okay, predictions for the future behavior of this star, Tiumi versus Archaea. So in comparing to paper 1, because T Ursa Minoris happened to be in this very rapidly changing region of the thermal pulse. We actually know whether we're going to know whether we were right about T Ursa minoris within the next few decades. So this is another figure that Laszlo made, which has where the authors of the paper were born. Yeah, we are responsible. Yeah, that today means 2019 in this case, and then retirement is optimistic, perhaps. Yeah, and I won't say who's who here, of course, among the authors. But this is fun. This is sexy. This is a good figure. Archaea, a bit less satisfying, but that's because we're in a different region, right? So predictions for the future behavior of Archaea, it'll take a few thousand years to discern between mass hypotheses, rather, right? And then that's because, so there's a lot, just in this little ridge here, you can see there's a lot of difference in the mass hypotheses if you're looking at this knee region, but they sort of collect and behave in a quite similar way when you're looking at the power down phase of the pulse. So just as luck would have it. There are a number of other candidates ripe for follow-up. So we're back in HR space now. Again, these are models computed and transformed with the missed color transforms. But so we've done Archaea, we've done T Ursa minoris. There's a few other ones that we're hoping to sort of put on this grid, see what the answer is, see if we can make any more kind of local predictions. Okay. Conclusions overall, massive paper. So we presented new period measurements and found that the pulsation period and amplitude of Archaea have continued to decline since the late 2000s, which is in contradiction with previous analyses, and that is new period data we've provided to the literature. We assessed the goodness of fit to Archaea of more than 3,000 astroseismic TPAGB stellar models, according to 6 different statistical metrics, 2 assumptions for its observed pulsation mode, and 2 different treatments of initial helium. We have shown that the fundamental mode is preferred over the O1 for Archaea's pulsation mode, and we predict that this star is in the power down phase of a sort of middle index thermal pulse, most likely somewhere between the 9th and 16th pulses. And we show that periods from gyre in non-adiabatic mode and periods inferred from nonlinear scaling relations do not differ significantly from periods computed under the simplifying assumptions for Archaea, but these discrepancies both increase as the model evolves along the TPAGB. The UVIS spectra, the isotopic ratio calculations for Archaea, previous literature parameter determinations, and modeling results all point to Archaea having undergone 3rd dredge up in its most recent thermal pulse. Using our best models, we demonstrated that the TP in Archaea started about 5 centuries ago. Archaea's maximum expansion coincided with or happened shortly before a recent dust production event, and the power down phase is expected to continue for a few millennia with a gradually slowing period decrease before reverting to expansion again. And while there are observational catalogs that classify AGB stars as exhibiting evidence of 3rd dredge up or not spectroscopically, this is, to our knowledge, the first argument for 3rd dredge up made on the basis of modeling grounds. I'm going to speak Hungarian now, so I hope no one speaks Hungarian. So, adjuval lo verebre means shooting a sparrow with a cannon, which is an amazing euphemism that I think we should have in English. This is a nod, of course, to the Hungarian and Hungarian-based collaboration of this paper, but also to the very big overkill big data approach we used in initially modeling Archaea that ultimately turned into an enormous grid. But we've made sure that our calculations have utility beyond this specific star, and this paper actually ships with an app. So the grids computed for this paper are 100% open source. It comes with a data visualization app to make the grid easier to use for your own seismic evolutionary problems. And here is a screenshot from the visualizer. So you can load any of the statistical realizations that I showed you, or even other ones. Each one of these points with mouse over information will show you the best pulse selected, which pulses are consistent with the model. It'll give you estimates for the age, for the fundamental parameters, all of these things. It's not quite open yet. It's almost there. But this comes with the paper, and open source science and open source software is something I personally am very committed to, and I hope that other people will use this and find utility in the data visualizer as well. And in conclusion, I will say Köszönöm szépen a figyelmet, which means thank you very much for your attention.
All right, well, we have time for maybe one or two at most questions. Also, thank you all for your questions throughout the talk. All right, yeah, one from Will.
You say that we won't know for 1,000 years or so what the state is of our hierarchy. But given the error bars you actually have realistically on period measurements and the tracks you showed there, it looks by eye like you ought to be able to distinguish them. Right? Like those are, 10 days apart or something.
This is a 1,000
Yeah,
here,
1,000 years. But
right?
even
So
here, like, are you just saying there's enough systematic uncertainty from the wandering or whatever?
the meandering,
Meandering.
yeah.
That you don't trust those curves to day or few day precision?
Or is it that the period measuring robots that work on these problems just won't be as good as we are?
No, so the meandering is something that we have to account for in kind of applying like a uniform uncertainty on the period. Like because we don't know what the underlying evolutionary shape is, we don't have a good idea of what that trajectory is. And there's so much variation in the meandering as well that I think far exceeds the spread of these curves in that region. Yeah. So what I want is for Mike Ireland or somebody like him to get meandering to work in simulations so that we can fit the meandering simulation to this part of the curve, remove it, and then know what the sort of underlying evolutionary slope is. Or you can do it. Jared can do it. Yeah. If anyone wants to do meandering calculations, feel free. I think we don't know well what the mechanism is the problem. Yeah.
How well measured are those periods actually? Because they're very long. So like how, you need a lot of data to measure a long period well.
Let me find some.
And I can imagine things that might look like meandering that are actually data issues. There we go.
Yeah. So these are the uncertainties are sort of the size of the markers here compared to the scale of the meandering, significantly smaller. So the precision on the periods is
So like 10-year periods, 10-year intervals measuring 1-year periods.
But the signal to noise ratio is insane.
But it's probably not exactly harmonic.
So you saw the curves, right? The signal noise ratio is in the thousands. So it's not the usual, like I can only measure my period to 1/t.
Mm-hmm.
It's like 1 over signal to noise times t. So in principle, you can measure it.
Yeah, I think the barrier to predictive progress on this is disentangling the meandering component from the evolutionary component. I think that's the wheelhouse it's in now.